Hello.
Hello.
That's right. It is YouTube time this time, all the time.
If you like poetry, if you like literature, if you like cultural history, then you've come to the right place. We make podcasts about all of those things. So be sure to like and share this video. And of course, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload.
Since we mostly make podcasts, you can also find our shows on all the major podcast platforms. So if you found this video, but YouTube isn't your speed for regular podcast listening, head over to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe there.
All right. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley.
And I am your other co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And together we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare moment, it would mean the world to us if you drop a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Those reviews help boost us up the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on so many different social medias.
On Twitter, the show is at Close Talking. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is at Connor M. Stratton.
On Instagram, the show is at Close Talking Poetry. And on Facebook, it's facebook.com/Close Talking.
We also have a whole website just for the podcast. It is closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show. And Cardboard Box Productions has a newsletter, Unboxed. So if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and on all the literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes.
All right, on with the show.
Hello, and welcome back yet again to Close Talking. I am your co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And I'm your other co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And before we dive into today's episode, just a quick plug that the best way to help our podcast find more listeners is through ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. So if you get a chance, it would mean the world to us if you could hop over and give us a rating and review there. We've been thrilled to have quite a few ratings and reviews come in during this poetry month, and it would be great to close it out with just a couple more. Meanwhile, we are barreling through Haiku Week here at Close Talking. We're closing out Poetry Month in style with an episode a day on that finicky little form, the haiku. And today we are taking on, having addressed the use of syllables in haiku and the way that there is a turn in the poem. The other major feature of the haiku is that, as it is popularly taught, there are 3 lines.
And yet,
sometimes there aren't. And that's cool too.
Whoa. This one is a tough one.
Yeah, this is the most mind-blowing to me. I remember when I first came across poems that were categorized as haiku that were not 3 lines. And by that point, I was like totally fine with the syllables going out the window. That always seemed weird to me. But like the line thing, for whatever reason, really threw me off.
Yeah. And the thing is, this is where I think the differences in the language, or at least not the language, but the poetic tradition sort of comes to play a bigger part. So we think of the 3-line haiku. But when haiku was sort of first being written, even though we think of haiku in 3 lines, it's important to, go back to the history of the form and, think about where it started. Not necessarily so that we adhere rigidly to it, but because I think it offers perspective on, where things have changed. Because it's one thing to say, well, haiku has always been 3 lines. And it's another thing to say, oftentimes now, in the trajectory of haiku, which has evolved significantly since the 1600s, 3-line haiku are now pretty common or predominant. But apparently, the pre-modern Japanese poets, and I'm quoting here from the book On Haiku by Sato, who's my new best friend, had no...
Hey.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jack. You're always my best friend. This is just my next best. Quote, pre-modern Japanese poets had no notion of lineation as a poetic device. What this means to me is that in the moment when haiku started to be translated into English, the poets who were doing the translating were steeped in obviously the poetic tradition that they were a part of, which was English and heavily dependent on lineating and line breaks and all that stuff. You know, that has long, you know, been a part of the English tradition since before Shakespeare. Lineation as a concept wasn't even a thing in the beginning. However, this quote goes on to say, to insist that a haiku should be a 1-line poem in English because the original Japanese poet had no sense of lineation is tantamount to insisting that no English grammatical article, such as a or the, should be used in translating Japanese sentences because the Japanese language includes no concept of articles. So here I think we arrive at the central problem is the line break a kind of best imitation of the effect that something about haiku in Japanese produces? And that is a very good question.
That's fascinating. Also, just the idea that there's a poetic tradition that doesn't include line breaks and doesn't include an idea of lineation, as you were saying, doesn't include lineation as a poetic device is just so fascinating. Because as anyone who's listened to this podcast knows, we spend a lot of time discussing and analyzing and looking at the tool of the line break because it is such a powerful tool to control the flow of a poem.
Yeah, and it's actually, I feel like it's almost the thing that's come to define what is a poem in English versus not. And you can sort of prove that by looking at, you know, like Instagram poetry, for example. And I'm not going to get into any bones I may or may not have to pick. But some people may say that certain Instagram poets are not writing actual poetry, but are writing statements or pieces of wisdom or something that is made to look like poetry.
Aphorisms, perhaps.
Aphorisms, perhaps. Without getting into the weeds there, the thing that they do to make it seem like it's poetry is a bunch of line breaks. And the big joke, I had an English teacher who had written a story and when she was in school, and she was like, LOL, poetry is dumb, which was really not a great introduction to poetry and almost ruined poetry for me, as I'm sure it did many other students. In America, the tragedy continues. And she was like, I don't really want to write a poem, but I have this story, so I'll just chop it up into lines. And then they were like, great poem, very great poem. So
another example of this would be a poet like Bukowski. Some of his poems read as though they are line broken snippets of a memoir. Or a poem that we discussed on the podcast was Ted Kuzer's Abandoned Farmhouse. And we didn't really get into this in the episode, but you could look at that poem and say, well, what actually makes this a poem as opposed to just a short story? And there's a there's quite a bit of free verse poetry that falls into that zone. And I wouldn't argue it's just the line breaks, but you can look at that as another example of this question of sort of what is the device working that's making it a poem and how much of it is the line break.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this guy, my next best friend, Sato, he at least figures himself. I don't really know the current state of haiku lineation discourse, but he has positioned himself as the sad minority but staunch defender of the haiku as a one-line poem. And he has this one example that someone brought up of, why it might be better to think of it as a one-line poem. And it is another basho, and it's a hoku, so it's starting the renga. The sea darkens, and the voices of ducks faintly white, which is very interesting and a little hard to parse out, I think.
See, I think that's something that becomes a lot more mystical when it's on one line, because by separating out discrete parts of it, they become more direct references to something concrete as opposed to all part of one kind of hard to pin down whole.
Yeah, because the kind of the question is like, is this a sort of thing where we're saying the voices of the ducks are faintly white? Or are we saying the scene is faintly white as the sea darkens? And that kind of like ambiguity, this author and others would say is made possible by the fact of it being one line. If faintly white were sort of dropped to the third line, you could more easily be like, okay, this is like a tacked on clause at the end. The sea darkens and the voices of ducks, faintly white. But if it's like one line and it's this burst, the sea darkens and the voices of ducks faintly white, then you're kind of, you're trapped in this moment of, is this like a synesthesia thing? Anyway, but at the same time, one thing that has become clear is that, as with many things, when Americans and other people start doing something because they think it should be a certain way, it has the effect of reverberating in all directions. And so there's actually many Japanese poets from, along the 20th century who then started writing their own haiku lineated, sometimes in 3 lines, but there are some poets actually who like really go aggressively line breaky, and there's like 5 lines, they're splitting up words. But I think for the purposes of this episode, and because we're in the beautiful space of the podcast and you have only our voices and there's no visual cues to tell you when we're breaking lines, let us for a moment imagine that the haiku is one line. And here are some wonderful haiku that we found that I think are great. I think probably either way, but thinking of it as one line. So this one is by Hashimoto Takako, who was born in 1899 and she died in 1963. So sort of mid-century. In the moonlight, I sleep with one who's alive dying, which I love. And apparently the story behind that, as one could imagine, is that her husband was sort of had a prolonged illness, and she was often by his bedside as he was sort of slowly succumbing to his illness. And the other one that I love, and then we can talk about it a little bit. This one this one's great. And she's actually a pretty contemporary haiku poet. Mayuzumi Madoka. She was born in 1962. Plum scent on the borderline of I like you and I hate you. I love those. What are you thinking about?
Particularly with the second one, I'm thinking about how it conjures this specific scene of like sense memory and the idea that you get a whiff of a smell that reminds you of this person about whom you have such conflicted feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really right. And I love that like if it was a 3-line poem, it could end with and I hate you. Could be the last third line, which to me would be a totally different thing, because part of the beauty of it being one line is it's so on the borderline of I like you and I hate you. It's both at once, and it's that it captures that real like just stuckness of these two opposing feelings. And to me, it would be totally different if the I hate you was at the end and had its own line. It would feel like it sort of had the last word. Whereas that doesn't seem to be the case here.
And I feel very much the same way about the first one. In the moonlight, I sleep with one who's alive, dying. If you break that up in lines, I think you end up with probably dying alone on the last line. That feels the most right, of like ways to break it up that kind of feel like they fit the natural flow of the poem. And again, it's sort of like dying gets the last word and gets a little bit of undue weight, because what the poem's really about is being caught in that moment of tension between the two things. It's not about here is this and then there's this other thing that it's in tension with. It's that the tension is this smoother, more constant, gentler tension that's still powerful and still resonates, but it just creates such a different feeling about it when it's all on one line together.
Yeah, that's so right. Yeah, and there's instead of it being with someone who's alive who is also dying, it's like there's this one state of like alive dying.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is so right and so moving also to put it in that way. And it does feel like a lot more accurate to a certain kind of experience. Yeah, those ones are so good.
They're really incredible. Read them again.
I'll read them again. This is by Hashimoto Takako. In the moonlight, I sleep with one who's alive dying. And this is by Mayuzumi Madoka. Plum scent on the borderline of I like you and I hate you.
In the first episode of Haiku Week, we discussed the Renga, which is the linked verse game from which haiku evolved, and Connor and I have been writing a Renga back and forth over the course of Haiku Week, so here is our Haiku Week Renga as of day 4.
Spotting Brooklyn blossoms from the plains, a snowless white as snow.
The air is cold with pine. Or is it juniper? And does it matter?
Of raven pines for the needle to move on the sun's seething hot reply.
A long walk and a quick stop. Cold chocolate spring.
No one else likes sweet tang, chocolate chips, orange sherbet, solitude.
The man on the train says Romulus killed his brother. A long way from 6 a.m.
All roads lead to Lupin was a memoir I never wrote. Or maybe fanfic.
Spelly arms and fried stupid. I'm witched into stunning, wizarded a world away.
Hey, thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Those reviews help us with the algorithm and are the best way for us to find new listeners.
Do you have thoughts about this poem? Or is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? We would love to hear from you, and there are tons of ways to get in touch.
Yes, you can send us an email to closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. I'm at Jack Rossiter Munn, Connor is at Connor M. Stratton, and the show is at Close Talking.
On Instagram, we are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/closetalking.
And speaking of all of those many and varied social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena. Woo woo! Woo.
Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Come back again.
Please come back. Just one more time.
Door's always open. Okay, bye.
See ya.